There are currently 53 silver augments. Now, the last time I made some augment tier lists, there were only about like 30 for each tier, so I'm definitely not going to be as confident in each of my picks as I haven't been able to play all of the augments as often, just because there are so many more. But I've definitely seen them all at least like once, and I've definitely tried to take them as much as possible so I know how strong they feel. Without further ado though, let's get right into our first augment, which is going to be a new one in EscAPADe. Now what this augment does is that it converts 100% of your AD into ability power, and additionally it increases your overall ability power by 10%. Now every champion gets base AD, which scales with level, so even if you aren't building any AD, you will be getting a fair amount of AP with this rune already. So take a champion like Veigar, for instance. As soon as you take the rune at level 3, you will get, well, more than 52 AD, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but you'll be getting that as AP, and you'll also, at level 18, be gaining 97.9 AP from this rune, which is actually quite good. Additionally to that, you gain an extra 10% ability power, which is pretty nutty, and I think this augment is quite strong for AP champions. I'm going to put EscAPADe in the weaker early, OP late category because I think AP champions in general just aren't that strong in the early game, but this is definitely a pretty solid option. If you see it later in the game, it is ridiculously strong again because you'll be having more AP, so you'll be benefiting from that 10% extra, and just converting that base AD that you are getting into ability power will be quite nice. I think the idea behind these runes is for you to go for like a hybrid build and then to benefit from both stats, but you don't even need to do that in order to benefit from it, as you do have that base AD. I'm pretty sure it works with base AD. It might not, but it would probably say just bonus AD if it didn't do it that way. But one of those hybrid items that is really good to build when you have EscAPADe is Hextech Gunblade, as it gives you 100 ability power and 50 attack damage, which means you'll actually be gaining 150 ability power just from this one item if you have this rune, which is very strong. If I thought AP champions were any better, I'd definitely be putting this augment higher, but for now it is going to stay here, and is probably the best AP augment out there actually, which seems kind of weird because it is based around an AD scaling mechanic. Now the next augment we have was an arena when it was first out, and that is Blunt Force, and all it does is increase attack damage by 15%, and last time I had it and happy to have, and I'm going to keep it there. It's a pretty simple rune, just gives you more attack damage. If you have a lot of attack damage, it's good, but it's nothing too crazy at all. Now the next augment we have is Buff Buddies, and I had it on the old tier list at OK early, met late, and I'm going to keep it there. Pretty much the exact same problems. It is good in the early game, having that little bit of red buff regeneration that's slow, and having that blue buff to give you mana in case you do run out of it, which is really, really rare. So there's just not a lot of instances where this will really make that much of a difference, but at least it does do things for you, which some of the other augments might not be able to. Then we have another old rune in Castle, which replaces your Flee with the ability Castle, which lets you switch locations with your ally. And I'm going to put this in a new category that we have, which is going to be called Replaces Flee. Now, Castle is actually a decent ability, but the problem is Flee is also a really decent ability. I actually think it's a really strong one. It's pretty much a powerful ghost, and it's even stronger if you want to like kite away. And while Castle could be good for you to like make some wacky, interesting plays, and it does give you 50% bonus movement speed, Flee itself is already good enough that you don't really need to replace it. It's kind of the question, like, is Castle really that much better where you want to replace something that is already good, if you could instead just take any other silver augment that would help you out, because the other silver augments don't replace something that is already useful. Next we have Clothesline, where you form a tether between you and your ally that burns enemies in a 50 unit radius, dealing 5 to 75 based on level magic damage every 0.25 seconds. And honestly, this one looks really cool, and you think that it would be pretty decent based on how red the laser is. It looks like it will do a lot of damage, but as you can see based on the stats, it's not too crazy. Everybody starts the game at level 3, and it does do the damage every 0.25 seconds, so if you can keep someone in the laser for an entire second, let's say at like level 4, then you will be dealing 86.75 damage to them, and in the late game if you do reach level 18, then you'll be dealing 300 damage in a second if you're able to keep them in the laser, which honestly just isn't the most damage, especially late game where tanks can have up towards like 10,000 plus health, where Clothesline just won't really do too much. Another big problem with Clothesline is that you might be tempted to try and play around it a little bit too much, where you're trying to get the Clothesline burn and then you'll be overthinking the game, because it's not that easy to keep somebody in the tether, as they can also clearly see it, so they'll just avoid it if they are worried about the damage. But the damage itself isn't even that crazy. While the augment itself looks really, really awesome, and I love the color red, I'm gonna sadly have to put it in the if I have to tier. Sure, it does do something, but it is pretty negligible, and it can actually mess up your game a little bit if you are just trying to concentrate on the Clothesline damage too much. Now we have Contract Killer, which is one of my favorite augments, and it's returning. And I actually got buffed where it used to target one champion and then they would take 15% increased damage from both you and your ally. But now it is 20% damage, which surprises me because I thought this augment was already really strong, and also grants you and your ally 350 gold when they die. Now when you get a kill in Arena, you already get 350 gold, and if you get the Contract Killer kill, that means you would be getting 700 gold a round, which is actually the same price as a pot. So in theory, you can always have a pot in each round, which would make you stronger, which is similar to another augment we're going to talk about later, but you still get to keep this 20% increased damage. Now, I personally think that Contract Killer is still Omega OP, and I thought it would be at 15%. The extra gold is really nice because you can also save it up and sometimes be a whole item ahead in the later stages of the game if you and your teammate are able to get that extra kill. And because you're doing 20% increased damage to them, it'd be kind of weird if you're not able to get a kill, because for a silver augment, 20% increased damage is pretty ridiculous, especially when you compare it to anything else that we've talked about so far. Next we have Deft, that is another augment that is returning that also received a buff. It used to be 50% bonus attack speed and now it is 60% bonus attack speed. And this augment I had also placed in Omega OP tier, but now I'm actually going to bump it down to OP tier. And not because I think that Deft isn't strong, it still definitely is. I just think that they added more augments that are pretty ridiculous. And the reason why Deft is so strong in my opinion is because the on-hit items are absolutely ridiculous. That gaining 60% bonus attack speed enables you to get more of those on-hit effects going on, which is just really strong in general, and it can be used by so many different champions, as bruisers can utilize it very effectively as well. Now we have a new augment in Dematerialize, where when you score a unique champion takedown, it grants you 18 bonus attack damage, or 30 ability power, and this effect lasts until the end of the round. Now it says that you get to keep this effect until the end of the round, but I don't think that's true. I think you get to keep it until the end of the game. From what I have played, you can actually get a ridiculous amount of adaptive force from this augment. Like I played with a Hecarim that had this, and then he got a ridiculous amount of AD because every time we got a kill for him, he would be gaining more attack damage. And I played against Alawi, who also had this, which gained a ridiculous amount of AD. I've also seen a Lux with it. So from my games, I have been seeing them gaining permanent stacking stats when they get shutdowns. So I'm not 100% sure what's really going on with this text. So if I'm somehow wrong and it is only until the end of the round, then this augment is pretty bad actually. But there's no way that is true. I definitely think it does last until the end of the game, and I'll explain that more in depth later on. But if it does work exactly like I think, then I'm going to put this in the Omega OP tier, because that is exactly what it is. Pretty ridiculously OP. Gaining free stats without having to buy items is very, very strong. The only thing is maybe you aren't able to get those takedowns, then you can definitely struggle. But in the early game, if you are able to even just get one each round, then you will be extremely strong in the late game, just having this extra amount of stats on a champion that normally wouldn't be stacking like that. Next up we have Desecrator, where when you immobilize an enemy champion, it applies 3 curse stacks to them for 5 seconds, stacking infinitely and refreshing with each application. And for each stack inflicted on targets, you gain a permanent 1 bonus health, and affected enemies are dealt 1 true damage every second. And Desecrator is going in the useless or niche okay tier. The problem with it is it actually takes a long time to get a bunch of stacks. Think about a champion like Leona, who has her E and Q in the early game. Let's say she CCs people 20 times in a round. That would mean you would get 20 times 3 stacks of curse, which means you'd be gaining 60 bonus health. And honestly, 60 bonus health is not very much in the game when you could be getting other runes. Think about Dematerialize, for example. If you just get one takedown, you get 30 ability power, and I think 30 ability power is objectively better than 60 health, and you don't need to CC somebody 20 times in order to achieve that. That's kind of a ridiculous amount for me to say that you can do, but I'm just going to say that so you can see that it is pretty weak, even if you really high roll how many times you can CC somebody. And this 1 true damage every second, you're doing like 60 true damage every second, which isn't bad, but again, it isn't that ridiculous either because everybody has just so much more bonus health with the arena stat adjustments. Next up we have Don't Blink, where you deal 1% increased damage per 10 movement speed you have more than the target. And this one I'm going to put in the useless or niche okay tier. I talked about it back in the old tier list, where it's only really good, I can imagine, on Master Yi, but then you have to be level 6, and even then, it's not really that ridiculous. I mean, compare it to Contract Killer. You and your teammate are going to be dealing 20% more damage just because they have that little mark on them. And this one, you need to be 200 movement speed faster than someone in order to get the same benefit that you would get from Contract Killer, but you also don't get the 350 extra gold. So I do think it can be kind of useless because also if you're like slower than the enemies, then you're not going to benefit at all from this augment. And there are a lot of slows in the game where that might just end up happening. Now we have another new augment in Don't Chase, where you pretty much get a permanent singed Q, which leaves a poison trail, which also grants you ghosting and continuously create a toxic cloud behind you that lingers for 3.25 seconds, and the cloud inflicts a poison to enemies within every 0.5 seconds, which deals 3.75 damage up to 37.5% based on level. It also scales with your bonus AD, and it also scales with your AP, and it deals the damage every 0.25 seconds over 2 seconds. And similarly to Clothesline, the damage is pretty negligible, but I think it is easier to proc and doesn't require as much coordination with your teammate, as it doesn't have a little effect between you and your ally where you have to actually hit into them. Instead, it just leaves it behind you. It can discourage enemies that want to chase you down because they might not want to be in the poison. Even though it doesn't do the most damage, it does a decent amount, especially in the early game. I'm going to put this in the okay early, meh late category, because once people have a ton of health, then the damage really is pretty negligible, as the scaling on it is literally 3% magic damage, which is pretty much absolutely nothing. I will say though, if you do end up building like a Rylai's or a Leandry's, this would proc it, which is pretty powerful, as you can get a cheeky Rylai slow with Don't Chase, similarly to what Singed would be doing, which is quite a nuisance, but not enough for me to want to put it any higher, as a lot of the champions that would want to take this augment wouldn't really be building Rylai's, as I think it is better in general on like more tanky champions, although I could see it being good on certain mages, but normally you would be wanting to take a different augment instead. Next up we have Erosion, which is coming back in the exact same state, where each instance of damage dealt to an enemy reduces their armor and magic resistance by 1.5% for 4 seconds, second up to 20 times for a total of 30% resistance reduction. And I think Erosion is still Omega OP, because it's pretty much like having a free black lever, but not only does it shred armor, it also shreds magic resistance, and a lot of times you'll be in a team comp where you have 1 AD and 1 AP champion, and being able to shred the resistances for your ally as well as yourself is just pretty ridiculously strong in my opinion, and amazing for a silver augment still. Now we have the reverse of AD APT, where we have EscAPADe. I guess it just says EscAPADe. What this does is it converts 100% of your AP into bonus attack damage, and additionally increase your attack damage by 10%. And I think this augment is pretty useless. Hello everyone, Editor Borax Almighty here, to tell myself that actually I'm pretty dumb. In the video I go on to explain how converting AP into AD isn't very good, but actually now that I'm thinking about it more, what you would do when you want to take this augment is you want to take it first on an AD champion, and then actually you just build AP items because they have a lot of this AP stat, and usually they have more AP than AD. So what can end up happening is you can actually get these builds where you have like a ridiculous amount of AP, but then it converts it all into AD, and so you're playing an AD champion with a ton of AD, and this augment can actually be sneaky broken. And also think about it, you can build an item like Zanya's, for instance, on Riven and be perfectly fine because you are actually getting AD. If you ever thought that Zed was already too much like a caster mage, well, now he can just build Rabadon's Death Cap, stack a bunch of AD, have like 800 because of all the AP he's getting, perhaps even more because he's already getting base AD. This augment could be sneaky one of the best ones in the game. Now that I'm thinking about it, you do have to get it first because you kind of have to make your build work around it. But with the AP items also having a lot of effects that scale with both AP and AD, such as Ludin's Tempest. That one, the splash damage works with AD. I believe like Night Harvester also works with both AP and AD. So actually, this one could be insanely strong. I definitely want to try it out sometime soon so I can showcase it to everybody, including myself, because that does sound like it would be a lot of fun. If I had to recategorize it, I'd probably put it in the weak early, OP late, because in the early game you won't really get any benefit from it as you don't have any starting AP compared to the other one where you have starting AD. But as soon as you do start getting some of those AP items online, then perhaps you can have an insane amount of AD and just absolutely wipe people, which would be really cool to see. So definitely want to check out this augment, and also this shows you that everyone can be wrong, so if you ever do see something else that you disagree with or just another thought, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Alright, back to normal Borax Almighty, and hopefully he doesn't have too many terrible takes. Then we have Executioner returning, which is going to be the exact same, where you deal 15% increased damage to enemies below 50% of their maximum health, and when you score a champion takedown, it resets the cooldown of all your basic abilities, and I'm going to put this in Happy to Have once again. I think this is just a worse version of Contract Killer. I will say though, the resets are better now that we are in the revive meta, because once you kill one person, you're going to immediately want to do as much damage as possible to the next person, so they won't be able to get the revive as comfortably. So in that regard, it is pretty good. It's just a generally nice rune, but because they have to be under 50% health and it only does 15% increased damage, it definitely is a weaker version of Contract Killer in my opinion, and definitely a strong rune, but nothing that is too ridiculously OP. Now we have Fallen Aegis, which pretty much just gives you a Morgana Black Shield at the beginning of the round that lasts for 12 seconds. And this augment was a lot better when the meta was more all about like one-shotting one person as fast as possible. But now that we have the revive mechanic, team comps are less focused on doing that and more focused on like longer drawn out fights. And in that regard, Fallen Aegis is definitely not as good, as that initial safety isn't as important. But that being said, it is still strong. It does give you like 12 seconds of breathing room that you know that you won't immediately get CC'd, and that you can look to try and make a play or step up aggressively in that time window. But sadly, because the time window also isn't that long, it can in some instances make you feel a little bit useless on bigger maps. Actually, for that reason, I'm actually going to keep it up here just because you could look to play aggressively like on a bruiser champion, like for instance a Riven or a Zed, where you can look to go in very aggressively and not have to worry about being peeled as hard because you do have that one instance of crowd control immunity. First Aid Kit is returning, but it is gaining a 5% buff, where it's now 25% heal and shield power, and this augment, I'm happy to have it, but it's nothing too special. If you are playing an Enchanter champion, you definitely will be happy to see First Aid Kit, but I don't think it will really influence the outcome of too many fights, as there oftentimes is enough damage to get over this heal and shield power. But perhaps on like champions like Swain, it could be even better because he has a lot of healing in his kit, or maybe even like a champion like Silas. But at the same time, if somebody builds healing reduction, then your First Aid Kit value will also be going down, so it's a decent rune, but nothing too crazy. Then we have Flashbang, which is another new rune, where when you use Flash, it creates an explosion around the blink location that deals damage, and it scales with your AD and AP, and slows them by 35% for 1.25 seconds, and additionally your Flash is now reset every round. And the best part about this is the fact that your Flash is now reset every round, so you always will have it up, because whenever I've taken this rune, I don't really notice the damage at all because it is quite low. Because I mean, 240 at max rank is pretty much nothing in Arena when people are super duper tanky, and it's like doing 7/10 of an auto, and maybe if you're like full AP, it's okay, like if you're building Kennen, but the damage itself is pretty hard to land. It really feels like this nearby enemies effect is really limited in range, where whenever I take it, I don't really ever notice it. So just getting your flashback every round is kind of useless, but sometimes it's niche okay. If you're playing a champion that really wants to have flash every single round, like Kennen, like Gragas, or just any other champion that really relies on flash to make a play going on, then Flashbang is okay, but those champions are also a bit weaker because of the revive mechanic and the existence of tanks, where usually these super duper flashy champions will struggle against those. So I just think in the current meta, having flash every single round is a bit less important than it might have been when being like really safe or being really aggressive really mattered, where now in Arena it matters a bit less. So oftentimes I would just rather have another augment than just having another flash. Which brings us to Flashy, which just gives you 3 charges of flash and have a 2-second cooldown between casts. And honestly, I think this one is maybe a little bit better than Flashbang because you get more flashes. I don't know if it automatically resets every round. I actually have not taken it. I've played against Flashy a lot of times. Actually, I have taken it once. I do think you get them back every single time. So I just think it is better than Flashbang if you do rely on flash a lot. But the fact that this augment doesn't give you any safety, it doesn't give you any extra damage, is pretty sad. You're just kind of relying on your champion just being strong enough to win if it just has one more flash, which, because of the existence of augments and thinking that like people will just be doing more damage than you or just being more tanky than you, because they actually have an augment that does something with like stats, then it kind of makes this like super duper utility augment not as good in my opinion. We're back to the returning augments with Frost Wraith, where you automatically root enemies within 450 units of you for 1 second on a 7-second cooldown. And this augment, every time I see it, it kind of does nothing. Every time I take it, it kind of does nothing. It's a bit of like a combo extender, but the game in Arena is still fast enough where just that little bit root is kind of negligible. You'd rather just have pretty much any other augment in most cases than Frost Wraith. There's never ever been an instant where Frost Wraith has really made that much of an impact. There's also a root, which is one of the weaker forms of CC, as I know people are still able to auto attack, and I'm pretty sure they're still able to cast spells, so it doesn't really shut them down that much. And for all these reasons, I'm going to keep it down here. Now we have Frozen Foundations, which replaces your Flee with a Nivea Wall. And while it is still one of my favorite augments and it looks really cool, it replaces Flee with something that isn't objectively that much better. You can try and make interesting plays with it. It has some quirks and merit to it. I will take it more often than I definitely should. But again, similarly to a lot of these other augments, it's just not going to be as consistent or as strong as ones that just give you decent combat stats. Which, I mean, these are definitely the more for fun augments. These are the more flashy ones, if you will. These will like enable you just to do like more interesting plays. Like we're playing Poppy, you can like set up the wall and then stun them into it, which is cool and fun. But at the same time, maybe you'd just rather have your team do 20% more damage and get more gold. Or maybe you'd rather just get kills and just gain permanent AD. Then have this one wall, which also gets rid of your very powerful Flee ability, which gives 40% bonus movement speed, which is just absolutely no joke. Now we have an augment that I have actually never taken and never seen in fully automated, where your augments with an automatic effect now have their cooldowns reduced by 3 seconds and benefit from your ability haste. And this is going to be the first augment we have in Strong but specific. There are a lot of augments with automatic effects that are very powerful, like the Silver Boomerang one. And there's some other ones that I can't think of at the moment, but I guess Frost Wraith would be one of them. It would lower that cooldown, and maybe then Frost Wraith would be a bit better. So if you have one of those augments, fully automated is going to be very powerful if that augment itself is powerful, but if it is not, then it isn't going to do anything for you at all. And it's definitely going to be good, especially if you have a lot of ability haste, because then that automatic augment will be going on quite often, and usually they're pretty powerful, except for Frost Wraith. Now we have Goredrink, where you gain 20% Omni Vamp, and I'm always happy to have this. I think it is quite a strong augment. I don't think it's one of the best ones, as Omni Vamp can be a bit tricky of a stat, especially because it can be just shut down a little bit when somebody buys healing reduction. It's a very nice augment if you are a champion that normally doesn't have any Omni Vamp in their kit. If you're playing like an AP champion, or even like a Bruiser Tank style champion that would rather have like Stride Breaker or something like that, then Goredrinker is quite nice. But because it doesn't do any extra damage and doesn't really make you that much more tanky, it just has that nice little chance where you can out-sustain your enemies. It's definitely decent, but nothing too crazy. Now, Guilty Pleasure is returning, but they actually nerfed it for tanks, where it used to be plus 4% maximum health whenever you would immobilize an enemy champion, but now it's plus 2% maximum health and has this base stat, which is going to be pretty much negligible, as level 4 you get like 40 health every time you immobilize an enemy, and when everybody just has more health in arena, it's definitely not that noticeable. I mean, at level 18 you get 180 health, which is pretty much nothing when you're getting to that like 10,000 health threshold. But once you're at that really high threshold, the 2% maximum health heal is really good. For this reason, I'm going to put it in the weaker early, OP late category. I keep mentioning this 10,000 health threshold, but it is actually surprisingly easy to hit in a lot of games. And if you have that 10,000 health, then 2% of that will be 200 healing every time you CC somebody. And while I just said 180 wasn't that much, 380 is a lot better. But yeah, maybe it's actually not as strong as I think. But every time I do look at the stats, it is quite effective. And I mean, 380 is nothing to sneeze at, especially when you are already quite tanky, as just having that extra bit of survivability while being that tank is really annoying for your opponents. Again, this can be weakened if people are building healing reduction, but a lot of times people won't actually think about building healing reduction if somebody has guilty pleasure, while if they see Goredrink, those champions are definitely going to more think about building healing reduction. Now we have Heavy Hitter, where your basic attacks deal bonus physical damage equal to 5% of your maximum health. And this one is definitely weaker early and definitely very OP late. You see, 5% of that 10,000 health threshold is 500 damage. If you're playing a tank, just doing any form of damage is quite nice, as you are already being useful in other ways. And just having the tank being able to do that extra damage to you with every single auto attack is absolutely annoying. It is very powerful. With builds like Titanic Hydra and Heartsteel, just having all of this health and having all of this health equal damage is very scary in the late game for carries, and they might be quite shocked to see that they are getting blown up by a tank. Now you have Hold Very Still, which gives you Teemo's passive, and what Teemo's passive is when you stand still, you gain invisibility, and when you leave that stealth, you gain extra attack speed, and the extra attack speed is nice. The problem with this is that people take it and then they absolutely try to like play around it. But at the beginning of the match, you get to see the position of the enemies, so you can know if they are using Hold Very Still, because you can kind of see them just standing still, and then you can try and use like AoE abilities to poke them. Pretty much what ends up happening is you just gain like 1 instance of extra attack speed for 5 seconds. And while 80% at max rank is really good, which will be level 15, you get that for 5 seconds. Deft gives it to you the entire match of 60%, which you will only achieve at level 10. So I think just Deft is way better because it gives you for the entire match. And I'm actually going to put the Hold Very Still in super niche or self-nerf. Maybe there's an interesting strategy which you really need some kind of invisibility on for it to work. But I think that a lot of times what will happen is you'll be trying to use Hold Very Still by just like standing still in one position and be like, haha, I can maybe get the stealth off and then they won't be able to hit me. But maybe you won't be able to do that for the 1.5 seconds, as the map is rather small. They'll know that you're trying to do it because they can hit tab and see that you have it, and then they'll just pretty much end you with any ability that can hit you even when you're invisible. So a lot of times you take it and you'd rather just have any other augment that does things more consistently, but it can be fun to maybe try and play around. One strategy that I just thought of that could be fun with Hold Very Still is Shaco, where you could like Q invisible and then just stand still. And before the Shaco stealth expires, you could maybe get the Hold Very Still stealth as well, which would be quite funny. But even then, all you are is invisible at that moment, so unless the boxes that you have can absolutely 1v9, it won't be too great. Now we have Homeguard, where you gain 100% bonus movement speed, and this bonus is lost for 3 seconds after taking damage. Movement speed is an okay stat, but because it's only movement speed really at the beginning of the round, it's kind of whatever. I'm going to put this in the useless or niche okay tier. There's very few instances where I would see you taking this over anything else. One champion I think that can utilize this pretty well would be like Hecarim, for instance, or maybe a Warwick, because they can use their ultimate or just like Hecarim's E to really go in really fast and try and win the fight in that way. But especially for like Warwick, I think there are just better augments out there, as being faster with your ultimate doesn't actually do more damage. At least in Hecarim's case, maybe he can go for a full lethality one-shot build with Homeguard, but I don't think that's very realistic either, as it only really doubles your movement speed, which isn't too crazy. Ice Cold is returning in the same exact capacity, where your slowing effects reduce movement speed of targets by an additional 100, and I'm going to put this in the strong but specific tier. One of the base cases of using Ice Cold is Heimerdinger and Zyra building Rylai's and then keeping enemies trapped with their turrets. But the most OP use of Ice Cold that I've seen is actually with Yorick, and he goes Sharildas, and the ghouls actually end up slowing you permanently and just kind of one-shotting you without you being able to kite away from them. So Ice Cold, Yorick, very strong, very interesting, but also very specific. And it also requires you having the right item for you to use it, so in the early game it can be a bit weaker until you're able to purchase the items you need. Alright, we've got a couple augments we've done in the past, like Infernal Soul, which I'm just happy to have. It's not too crazy, doesn't do the most damage, but it does do some damage. We have Juice Box, which I used to call the Hat Augment, and I'm still going to call it the Hat Augment. I haven't seen anybody take it in this iteration of Arena, because just getting one of the juices for free is not very strong. You'd rather almost always have any of the other augments. If you would always get to pick which juice you would get each round, that might be a little bit better. But because you don't and it is random, it just doesn't feel that great. Then we have Light 'em Up returning, which is a on-hit effect. And the on-hit effects are super duper strong in general because there is no attack speed cap and you can get so much attack speed. Just having anything that does more damage if you can hit people more often is very annoyingly strong. Then we have one of my favorite augments, even though it's super simple. You just grant bonus health equal to 50% of your maximum mana. And because everybody gets bonus mana, this is already better than you might think. And honestly, the tier items are pretty strong, especially with Mind to Matter, where I'm going to put it in the strong but specific tier. It's definitely way better if you can get it early, so you can build one of those tier items, as it takes 2 rounds for them to stack. And if you get it later, maybe you don't have as much mana as you would want for you to benefit from Mind to Matter. Now we have Mirror Image, which gives you LeBlanc's passive, which when you get damage to below 30% maximum health, you get a clone of yourself and you become invisible, and the enemies have to try and figure out which one it is, which is just really, really annoying. And whenever I can see I can take it, I'm happy to have it. The nice thing about the creation of the clone is you actually get a frame of invincibility, and you also get the chance that the enemies hit the wrong target, which is quite strong, that you can get away and maybe get some power flower effects. This augment is really annoying because of that invincibility period. It's kind of almost like a very miniature Zanya's, where you can't just instantly one-shot people because they will get this invincibility proc. So honestly, I could see it being even stronger. But if the enemies are still able to just kill you even after you get the clone, then it doesn't really do that much more for you. But it is one of the best augments in keeping you alive. Now we have Mountain Soul, which grants you the Mountain Dragon Soul. And I believe they have buffed it a little bit, but I did take it recently, and the shield is still absolutely pathetic. You don't get any of the mountain dragons, so you're not gaining that extra percentage of armor and magic resistance, which just makes the mountain dragon not as good, and the shield is just not that impressive in general. Now we have the augment, which on the last tier list was the absolute worst in my opinion, which is Now You See Me. And I'm going to put at the bottom of Replaces Flee. I do think this is still probably the worst augment. You replace your Flee with an effect where when you use a dash, you can cast Now You See Me and then return to that location. And it's just honestly really wonky. You can build a lethality item, which does the exact same thing that I talked about last time, which is just pretty much the same thing. You do get some bonus movement speed once you've done it, but you can also just get that movement speed very simply if you use Flee, and you don't need to do all of this complicated thinking that you have to do with Now You See Me. So yeah, it just doesn't do too much. It's maybe like a little bit tricky for one instance, but you'd rather just have any augment that was useful. Now we have the last soul that you can get, which is Ocean Soul. And originally I wasn't the biggest fan of it, but after taking it and seeing other people take it, I'm definitely going to put it in the OP tier, but it's going to be at the lower end of it. In the early game, having Ocean Dragon Soul is pretty ridiculous in keeping you alive, giving you good sustain, and getting if you do need mana, this is a lot better than blue buff, red buff, because the healing in Ocean Dragon Soul is just a lot better. The healing on this scales with AD, AP, and health, which is nice in general. And if you ever hover over it, you can see just how much healing it does. It is pretty ridiculous. The only reason it's not in the Omega OP tier is because of the existence of Heal Cut, which can just nerf this augment really easily. Repulsor is returning, where upon dropping below 60 or 30% of your health, you knock back all enemies. And this one is, again, one of the best augments at keeping you alive, similarly to Mirror Image, but the fact that it has 2 procs is really nice, and it just helps you kite very effectively. It's really good in the early game, where you're contesting over those power flowers, as you can knock them away from them, and also if you're fighting like in the zone where it's really close, you can knock them into the zone, making them take damage, which is just a very powerful effect. And again, those 2 procs, very, very good in the late game, as it really can weaken enemies who are trying to chase you down from getting on top of you, as you get like a free little condemn to get them away from you. Now, scoped weapons used to only be a gold augment, and it was one of the most OP gold augments out there, as extra range is very powerful, but now there are 3 versions of it, a silver, a gold, and a prismatic version. And the silver augment I'm gonna put in the OP tier, but not that OP. It's honestly not that much range, but having just any instance of extra range will help you kite, will help you surprise enemies, especially if you are a melee champion. It can just make your champion feel a bit more smooth. Just think about Tryndamere, he got his attack range buff and everybody was complaining about it nonstop because it was really annoying to play against, so just getting that extra range is quite nice. Self-destruct is probably the most troll augment in the entire game. I've taken it a couple of times. I've seen enemies take it. And what it is at the beginning of the round, you get a bomb attached to you that detonates after 15 seconds, and it will deal true damage equal to 20% of the target's maximum health and knock them up for 0.75 seconds. But the problem is the enemies will just clearly see that you have this bomb on you and will just run away from you or kite away from you. I've seen like a Vayne take this, and then she was trying to like just roll into me, which was just absolutely troll. Which is why I'm going to put this in this super niche or self-nerf tier. I think this could maybe be good on like a Nautilus or a Maokai, but if the enemies have like any form of CC or any form of peel, they can just like wait until the 15 seconds is about to be up and just get you away from them. And even if you do actually successfully land the self-destruct damage, it does 20% of your health, which is nice. So if you have like a ton, it will be dealing a lot of damage, but in most instances it'll be just doing like 0 damage or some damage to like the enemy frontliner, which isn't too crazy because the arena maps are just too big, and this 350 units distance is actually quite small. The next new augment we have is Serve Beyond Death, which pretty much just puts you in Renata Glask's W when you die, meaning you are restored to 100% of your maximum health, but you suffer true damage, burn equal to 10% of your maximum health every 0.264 seconds, and then you will actually die again. But if you do get a champion takedown, it ends the burn immediately and sets your current health to 20% maximum health, and this augment is actually really, really OP. A lot of fights in Arena are usually really, really close, and just being able to respawn at all of your health so you can do all of your damage again really, really quickly is very powerful, especially with the revive mechanics in the game. Just being able to live that little bit extra longer so that you can fight the people and maybe even revive your teammate, as I believe that when you are in the Serve Beyond Death state, you can still revive your teammate, that they can then come up and finish off the fight, hopefully win it for you guys, is quite annoying. I mean, also think about it like whenever you're fighting a Scion, then he goes into his passive and he's able to do all of that extra damage. It is quite annoying. So you could, in theory, have a Scion with his passive and then Serve Beyond Death, just never ever dying, and you would have to kill him pretty much 3 times, and for a silver augment, that is quite strong. Shadowrunner is returning, where upon casting an ability with a dash or blink, or exiting stealth, you gain 300 bonus movement speed for 2 seconds, and this one is quite strong, but also quite specific. You need to have a champion that has either a dash, blink, or a stealth, and if you do, then you can be quite annoying. I talked about it last time I made this video. Master Yi with his Q is really annoying. Fiora is another champion that uses Shadowrunner really well. Silas can use it with his E and his W to make himself just very, very fast. And 300 bonus movement speed is honestly better than like Homeguards, for instance. So yeah, quite good to have Shadowrunner on those champions. But at the same time, it doesn't mean you're doing any extra damage, so it's nothing too ridiculous either. Another new augment that they've added, which has turned out to be one of my favorites, is Slap Around. And how this works is when you immobilize an enemy champion, it either grants you 12 bonus attack damage or 20 ability power, which stacks infinitely, and this effect lasts until the end of the round. And I'm going to put this one in the weaker early but OP late tier. This augment is really good on tanks that have a lot of CC in the late game. If you have a ton of health, like on that Leona or like on a Nautilus or even like on a Blitzcrank, if you're able to just keep using your CC spells on somebody, at some point you'll actually just have a ton of AD where your auto attacks will be doing a bunch of damage. Especially for a silver augment, it is quite strong, and they have to be a little bit hesitant of letting you live, because if they're trying to focus on your ally instead of you, you will actually reach a point where you can then just easily 2v1 with having all of these extra stats. In the early game, it's not as strong because you won't have as much CDR, which means you'll be doing less immobilizing abilities, and it can also be weak if the enemies just kite you to your death. It also can be weak if you are never able to land any of your immobilization spells and if they just kite you. It also can be weaker if the enemies just one-shot you, because then you'll never be able to CC them, as it doesn't give you any extra strength initially. You do need to actually use CC in order to build up some stacks. Again, going back to Dematerialize, this one would be very, very weak compared to Slap Around, as you need a whole entire takedown in order to gain 30 ability power, 18 bonus attack damage, while this one you just need to immobilize in order to get the same effect pretty much. You actually get a little bit less attack damage or ability power, but like, let's say you just CC someone with an EQ from Leona, if she's like going AP or even AD, you would be getting already more AP or AD than getting a takedown. So Dematerialize would be one of the worst augments if it actually does work the way it is stated on this website, but I don't think it is. I do think it is permanent. While Slap Around, I know for a fact, only lasts for that round. Now we have Snowball Fight, which replaces your flee with Mark from ARAM, and if you land the Mark, you can then dash towards the enemy target, and this goes in the replaces flee tier. Flee, again, is just a very powerful summoner spell. Honestly, if I started the game with Mark, I might choose an augment where I get flee instead. It is okay because Mark is a pretty good summoner spell, but it isn't anything too crazy either. You would rather pretty much just have any other augment that does more. Sonic Boom is returning, but it is being nerfed a little bit. It used to be 40 to 160, it looks like, true damage whenever you heal, buff, or shield an ally, but now it is 30 to 150. But the damage isn't really what's important. What's more important is the slow that it gives you, which is 30% for 2 seconds. And also, this ability has a 450 unit range, which is better than the 350 range of self-destruct, as it is actually way more reliable for this to go off. And in the early game, the damage actually does ramp up. You actually can look at it if you hover over it. If the fight goes on for a long time and you are able to spam heals and shields, it can be quite strong, especially on somebody like Tarek, who is just constantly using his heals or shields. Asona is another champion that with her E and W is constantly getting these Sonic Boom procs. And because those two champions exist and are able to use it so effectively, I'm going to actually put it in the Omega OP tier. Because for those champions, this is so strong, especially in the early game, just because it does really give your team so much more kite potential, and that extra little bit of damage that an enchanter normally would lack is no longer there as much, as they are able to use this ability so often, as it only has a 2-second cooldown. As long as you're using your abilities in these 2-second time frames, then if the enemy champions are near the target that you are healing or shielding, they'll constantly be slowed by this 30%. Now we have a very cool sounding augment in Spin to Win, which I've only been able to get once on Lilia, even though I've been playing Garen trying to specifically get Spin to Win. And what it does is your spinning abilities deal 20% increased damage and benefit from 20 ability haste. Pretty simple, and I think this is in the strong but specific tier. You need to have a champion that has a spin effect in order to use it. And while 20% increased damage is nice, especially for like Garen, who uses E to do a lot of his damage, again, I'm comparing it to something like Contra Killer, where you're just always doing 20% extra damage with all of your abilities, or even like Executioner doing 50% increased damage with all of your abilities. Those are just a lot better, and like the attack speed ones, I think just might have higher highs. I don't know how Garen's scaling is with attack speed. I wonder if Deft might be better actually damage-wise than Spin to Win. Could be interesting to see. The fact that they get 20 ability haste is nice, but it isn't the most either. So definitely strong, but it is quite specific. Now we have a very, very weird augment in Stackosaurus Rex, which doubles the number of permanent stacks you gain from abilities. The reason why this one is weird is it doesn't really work on like certain passives, like Vhagar passive, I'm pretty sure. If you're like getting stacks, you aren't getting it from that because that's not an ability, it's a passive. This one, I've been trying to do research on seeing like what champions this works on, who it doesn't. One champion I saw that it seems to maybe work on is like Soul, but even that one kind of confuses me because he has his passive. Honestly, I hope people can test this more and let me know. I'm going to put it in the weak early, OP late category. I think this does work on a champion like Senna. Maybe it does now work on champions like Vhagar. I remember on the PvE it wasn't, so maybe now it is. I haven't been able to test it out, as again there's so many augments, and I have to like specifically play a champion that has a stacking mechanic and then get this augment, luckily enough, even though there's 53. So sadly, I've not been able to test it. I've not been able to see it that much. The one time I did see it was that Senna, who was able to get stacks. and maybe this one could be Omega OP, could be ridiculous, but I just haven't seen it enough for me to really know how to gauge it properly, and I hope you guys can actually help me know how strong this can be. But there's no way it's not going to be weaker early, OP late, because that's just how all stacking champions are. Now we have Tinker Leave It, which was the augment I put in first place last time we did this tier list, and that was because the damage reduction it gave you was 40% instead of the now 25%, and I believe when it first came out it might have been something like 60%, which is absolutely ridiculous. And the way this works is you gain this critical defend chance equal to your critical strike chance up to 60%, which means that you have if you have 100% critical strike chance, that means that every instance of damage you have a 60% chance for it to deal 25% less damage. It's a bit confusing, but pretty much what you do is you take this augment, you build a bunch of crit, and then you hover over the stats on it and you say, wow, that reduced a lot of damage, which is quite good, especially because it's reducing damage on a squishier champion, which does matter a lot. You can even take this on tanks and then build like Atmas, which gives you critical strike chance, and just taking 25% less damage is really good. And the fact that it also gives you 20% critical strike chance just flat like that is quite nice, and it definitely still belongs in the Omega OP tier, but I'm actually going to put it third because it did go down from 40% to 25%, which is quite a large nerf, but it is definitely deserved, and it is definitely still strong in my eyes, because even just gaining 20% critical strike chance is decent, and then still having the opportunity to have 25% less damage given to you is very strong. Now the next augment, Tormentor, I absolutely trashed in my original tier list. I said this rune was pretty weak. I lowered it as one of the lower ones, and I was scared that I was going to get backlash because I thought that people would be thinking that doing percent maximum health damage would be quite good. In my video, I argued that it was quite hard to get the immobilizing effect off to try and CC them, and then it is hard to stack up the damage, but if you do stack up the damage, it would be okay. Now, if you look at the stats now, 4% of the target's maximum health every time you immobilize someone, and it stacks. So the second time you CC someone, that will be doing 8% of the target's maximum health, up to 12%, and then 14, 16%. It actually does stack up quite a lot. You might be wondering how on earth could I have rated it this low? Well, if you look at the original video, you can see that it was actually 0.8% of the target's maximum health. So they more than quadrupled the damage when I originally rated it, which does make it a lot better. Now that it's 4% instead of 0.8%, I'm actually going to put it in the weaker early, OP late tier. The reason why it isn't as good early game is because people just don't have that much health, so it doesn't matter as much. But in the late game, people are going to have a ton of maximum health, and then Tormentor really will be nice, especially because you have lower CDRs again, to get more of your CC abilities off. The problem again with Tormentor is it does require a condition where you need to immobilize champions in order to get the effect, so if you're never able to actually hit somebody because you're getting kited, then it won't really do anything for you. But if you are able to stack that CC on somebody who is immobile, then you'll be absolutely blasting them at some point with a ton of percent health damage, which is the best kind of damage you can do in Arena. Just a few more augments to go. Now we have Typhoon, where your basic attacks fire a bolt at an additional target that deals 30% AD and applies on-hit effects at 100% effectiveness. This one is not as good in the early game, but late game it is absolutely insane because the on-hit effects are so strong. Whenever you die to a Varus, a Kaisa, or any of these AD champions who build on-hit, just hover over the damage distribution at the end and see how much of that is from items. And to be able to do that to the enemy's ally as well as to the initial enemy that you're hitting is just absolutely ridiculous. This augment gets a lot better as the game progresses, but even in the early game it's not too bad because at least you're still doing 30% of your AD damage to the other person, even if you don't have any on-hit effects. But now that I'm saying that, every single champion has on-hit effects, as that is just one of the arena set adjustments, which is that 0.5% or something, 1.5% extra damage you are dealing. I kind of forgot exactly what the arena stat adjustment was. I'd have to go back and watch my arena stat adjustment video so I can refresh it, because it is kind of hard to keep track of it all. Now we have Ultimate Unstoppable, where casting your ultimate grants you crowd control immunity for 3 seconds on an 8-second cooldown. This one could be decent if you're playing a quirky kind of champion that has a low ultimate cooldown where you can constantly get this crowd control immunity. That being said, I think this is kind of useless or kind of niche okay. would be good on a champion like Warwick, who can ultimate and then it can't actually be cancelled because he has his crowd control immunity. That's probably one of the best case scenarios, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. But that is a very specific case, and maybe there's just a better augment out there for him anyways, as your ultimate isn't that powerful. Another thing is you don't just want to use your ultimate to get out of CC. It could be okay on like someone like Samira, because then you can't get your ultimate canceled again, but maybe you just rather have more damage because they always can just cancel your ultimate by killing you instead of CCing you. Now we have Virtuous Cycle, where your heals grant a shield for 5 seconds that is equal to 20% of the healing value, and your shields grant a heal equal to 20% of the shield strength. This one is returning again, and honestly, I think this one I'm just happy to have if I am playing an Enchanter. It's pretty similar to First Aid Kit. It pretty much, instead of just having like a stronger initial heal or shield, you're getting like a new form of heal or shield, which could honestly be a bit better. I don't play Enchanters that much, so I don't really know just how strong this is, but I can imagine if you are playing an Enchanter, this is one of the better augments you would want to see. Now we have Vulnerability, where damage dealt by items and damage over time effects can critically strike for 50% bonus damage, and additionally you gain 20% critical strike chance. Again, I think getting 20% critical strike chance in general is just pretty good, and honestly, the best form of vulnerability use that I found is when I was playing Garen, and I played Heartsteel with him. If you go like that Atma's item to get even more crit, then your Heartsteel damage can be absolutely ridiculous. The way Heartsteel works, I'm pretty sure, is that it is based on the damage you deal. So it's taking that extra damage you're doing and converting it into health. Yep, I'm checking it right now. It says that it is granting you permanent bonus health equal to 10% of that amount. I think it might be more in Arena. I'm not exactly sure. Actually, you can see right now, damage health ratio, bonus health chain changed to 12% of damage amount. So yeah, the more damage you can do with your Heartsteel, the better, which vulnerability will actually be able to do quite easily. And you can see that your Heartsteel stacks will increase quite quickly with this combo. If you don't believe me, here you can see just how much damage the Heartsteel crit can do.
It's just like, come back and fold
1142 with a Heartsteel proc is not bad at all. In fact, you can see that I went from 961 stacks all the way up to 1070, which is pretty good. Just 2 more augments to go. We have Warmup Routine, which replaces your Flee with the summoner spell Warmup Routine. Honestly, I thought this was a pretty good augment at some point, but even when I made my tier list last time, I already saw the flaws with it, which are pretty much that just people will know you have Warmup Routine and just run at you, and then you're not even able to get away because you have Flee instead of Warmup Routine, so oftentimes you actually almost get nothing out of this augment. I'm gonna put it at the top of replaces Flee because maybe the enemy champions don't realize you have it. Maybe you can get some sneaky stacks, because doing 24% extra damage isn't bad. But again, just compare it to Contract Killer. It just gives you 20% for free. It's just way better. It also gives you gold. So yeah, losing Flee for Warmup Routine, which sometimes will do nothing, feels really bad. Then the final silver augment we have is a very simple one, Witchful Thinking. I'm going to put this in the happy to have tier because whenever I'm playing an AP champion, I'm happy to get a free 70 ability power. It's actually surprisingly not as strong as the AD to AP one, because you will just have more AD in the late game, where you will actually be gaining more AP than you will be getting from Witchful Thinking. But at least Witchful Thinking at the very beginning of the game will instantly give you 70 ability power. So for those mages which are a little bit weaker, it does feel pretty nice, and it does scale pretty well with Rabadon's death cap, giving you the potential for even more AP. Well, that was my updated silver augment tier list. If you enjoyed it, I hope you leave it a like. Maybe consider subscribing, because the next thing I'll be working on is my gold augment tier list. So once again, thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have good matches in your arena games.